Don't waste your time with her. She can't afford this car. Those were the words that froze the showroom. Imani Ellison stood beside a midnight black luxury sedan, listening as her husband laughed with the salesman beside her, and for a moment the whole room seemed to hold its breath. Grant Whitmore thought he was being clever. He thought he was putting his wife gently back into her place, the place he had decided she belonged, and he had no idea that the woman standing 3 feet away from him owned the very floor he was standing on. Then the glass doors at the far end of the building opened, and the owner of the dealership walked in. His smile vanished the instant he saw her. "Mrs. Ellison," he said, "you're here early." Grant turned, confused, his easy grin faltering for the first time that morning. "Wait," he said. "You know her." The owner looked at Grant for a long moment, then quietly handed Imani a folder, before answering the question that would end a marriage in less than 60 seconds. "Of course I know her," he said. "She owns this dealership." Grant Whitmore stopped breathing, and somewhere behind his eyes, decades of assumptions began to collapse, one after another, like dominoes falling in a silence no one in that room would ever forget. The morning had started ordinarily enough, the kind of ordinary that made betrayal so much easier to hide inside. Grant had suggested the dealership himself, mentioning it twice at breakfast as though the idea had only just occurred to him, though Imani had learned months earlier to notice when her husband rehearsed his spontaneity. He wanted a new car, something that would announce his success to men he worked with, something that would make his colleagues nod a little longer when he walked into a room. Imani agreed to come along without protest, dressed simply, her hair pulled back, wearing nothing that would suggest to a stranger that she ran an investment firm worth more than the entire dealership combined. She preferred it that way. She had learned a long time ago that people revealed themselves most honestly when they believed no one important was watching. So she walked into that showroom as Grant's wife, and nothing more, and she let the room decide what that meant. Grant approached the salesman, a young man named Derek Sloan, with the confidence of someone who had already imagined how this transaction would make him feel. He gestured toward a black sedan sitting under the showroom lights like a centerpiece, and immediately began speaking about horsepower and leather interiors, as though reciting facts he had memorized the night before. Imani drifted toward the same car and asked, quite simply, how much it cost. Grant laughed before Derek could answer. "You don't need to know that," he said, waving a hand, as if brushing away a fly. It was a small sentence, almost forgettable, the kind of comment a stranger might not even register as cruel. But Imani heard it the way a musician hears a single note fall out of tune in an otherwise perfect symphony. It was not really about the price of a car. It was about a decision Grant had quietly made somewhere along the way, that his wife no longer had the right to know things, to ask things, to matter in the room where decisions were made. Derek turned his attention fully toward Grant after that, the way salesmen often do when one half of a couple signals who holds the wallet. Grant introduced Imani almost as an afterthought. "My wife," he said. "She's just here to look." Imani said nothing. She had long since stopped correcting men who underestimated her in rooms like this, because she had discovered something far more useful than correction, and that was observation. She noticed the dealership's layout, the way the newer paperwork sat unsigned on a back desk, the way certain staff members glanced nervously toward the manager's office whenever a customer asked a specific financial question. She noticed most of all that Malcolm Vey was not on the floor. That detail struck her as strange, because she knew exactly where Malcolm was supposed to be that morning, and she knew, better than anyone else in that building, precisely what he had been asked to bring with him. Grant circled the sedan once more, running a hand along its hood, like a man admiring something he had already decided belonged to him. He glanced back at Derek, and delivered the sentence that would define the rest of the morning. "Don't waste too much time with her," he said, nodding toward his wife. "She can't afford this one." Derek chuckled awkwardly, unsure whether it was a joke, and Imani simply looked at the car's reflection in the polished floor rather than at her husband's face. She did not defend herself. She did not raise her voice. In the pocket of her coat, resting quietly against her palm, was a set of keys stamped with the very same logo printed across the showroom's glass doors, and she had not yet decided whether today was the day she would let Grant find that out. A few other customers drifted near the sedan, while Grant continued speaking, and Imani noticed the way his voice rose slightly whenever strangers came within earshot, as though an audience made his performance more satisfying. He spoke about interest rates he barely understood, quoting numbers he had clearly picked up from some late-night financial program, nodding along to his own explanations, as though seeking approval from people who had not asked for any. Imani had watched this particular version of her husband many times before, the version who needed a stage more than he needed a conversation. What struck her this time, though, was how easily the performance slipped into cruelty, how naturally he reached for her diminishment as the punchline that made his own competence shine brighter by comparison. It was not new. It had simply never been this loud. The tension in the showroom thickened slowly, the way weather changes before a storm arrives, imperceptible, until suddenly it isn't. Derek's demeanor shifted the moment Grant established, without being asked, exactly who controlled the money in this marriage. Grant spoke about his salary, his promotions, the size of his annual bonus, weaving details into casual conversation with the practiced ease of a man who had told this story to strangers many times before. He made sure Derek understood, without ever saying it outright, that Imani was simply along for the ride, a spouse who supported the household in smaller, softer ways, while Grant carried the real financial weight. Imani listened without correcting a single word. She had grown used to watching her husband build a version of their life that made him the hero of it, and she had learned there was more information to gather by letting him talk than by silencing him. At one point, Imani turned to Derek and asked a question that had nothing to do with browsing for a car. "What purchase agreement template is the dealership currently using?" she asked, her tone even, almost clinical. Derek blinked, caught off guard, unsure why a customer accompanying her husband would care about internal paperwork procedures. Grant laughed loudly, the kind of laugh meant to be overheard, and told Derek not to mind her, that she liked to sound like she understood business even when she didn't. Imani let the comment pass over her, the way rain passes over stone, leaving no visible mark. Grant then asked Derek to bring the sedan around for a test drive, eager to feel the leather seats beneath him and the engine respond to his foot, already imagining the compliments waiting for him at the office on Monday morning. While Grant disappeared toward the service bay, with Derek trailing behind him, Imani remained near the front of the showroom, her eyes drifting toward a small brass plaque mounted near the executive offices. The plaque still listed the previous owner's name, the transition not yet formally announced to staff, which explained why no one on the floor recognized her. She studied the space with the quiet precision of someone auditing a business rather than admiring a car, cataloging inconsistencies that a casual visitor would never notice. Paperwork stacked slightly wrong, a financial ledger left open on a desk that should have been locked, the particular way certain staff members avoided eye contact when specific transactions were mentioned. Her phone buzzed softly in her pocket, and she glanced down to see a message from Malcolm. "I just arrived," it read. "Is he with you?" Imani typed back 3 words, her thumb steady despite the current running beneath her calm exterior. "Yes," she wrote. "He still doesn't know." To understand how a woman could stand so still while her husband humiliated her in public, one had to understand the 11 years that came before that morning. Grant Whitmore had once loved Imani with a devotion that friends still spoke about at dinner parties, the kind of love that made him drive 4 hours through a snowstorm just to bring her soup when she was sick during graduate school. In those early years, he bragged about her intelligence to anyone who would listen, introduced her as the smartest person he had ever met, and meant it every time. But something shifted as her career accelerated past his, slowly at first, then unmistakably. When people began referring to her as the chief executive rather than simply Grant's wife, something in him curdled, quietly, the way milk turns before anyone notices the smell. He stopped mentioning her title at social gatherings. He grew uncomfortable when colleagues asked what she did for a living, often changing the subject before she could answer for herself. He avoided introducing her to new business contacts, worried, though he never said it aloud, that her success would somehow diminish his own. Imani noticed the change long before she understood its full shape, and for years she tried to soften it, downplaying her achievements at home, letting him take credit for household decisions that were really hers, filling the silences where his ego needed reassurance. She never told him about certain investments, not out of secrecy for its own sake, but because she had learned that sharing her wins too openly seemed to cost her something in his eyes that she could never quite get back. In recent months, however, her caution had shifted into something closer to suspicion. She discovered discrepancies in shared accounts that Grant explained away too quickly. Debts he claimed were temporary and would resolve themselves without her involvement. Financial documents he signed without mentioning to her at all. She noticed he had begun visiting a particular car dealership with unusual frequency, always with vague explanations about networking or exploring investment opportunities. And buried in an email thread he had forgotten to close on a shared laptop, she found a name she did not recognize. Roland Pike. Imani did not confront him immediately. She did what she had always done best. She researched, quietly and methodically, until the picture became clear enough to act on. She remembered, too, the small cruelties that had accumulated so gradually. She had almost mistaken them for ordinary marriage friction rather than warning signs. The way Grant introduced her at his company holiday party as someone who dabbled in a little consulting on the side, when in truth, she oversaw a portfolio worth more than his entire firm combined. The way he corrected her gently in front of guests whenever she mentioned a business term, as though she needed the vocabulary explained to her, rather than having built her career on fluency in exactly that language. Each incident alone had seemed forgivable, survivable, the kind of thing a patient wife simply let go for the sake of peace. Stacked together, though, they formed a pattern she could no longer excuse away, a pattern that told her Grant had never quite made peace with being married to a woman whose success eclipsed his own, and that his discomfort had been quietly hardening into something far more dangerous than wounded pride. Back in the present, Grant returned from the test drive glowing with satisfaction, practically strutting across the showroom floor as though he had already signed the paperwork. "This," he announced to no one in particular, "is a car for people who actually have money." Imani looked at him evenly. "Are you certain?" she asked, her voice carrying no accusation, only quiet curiosity. Grant smiled, the confident smile of a man who had never once doubted his own competence. "I know exactly what we can afford," he said. Imani said nothing further. Instead, her gaze drifted toward the glass entrance at the front of the building, where a familiar figure had just stepped through the doors, and she felt the last piece of her careful plan click quietly into place. Malcolm Vey spotted Imani almost the moment he crossed the threshold, and he walked directly toward her with the unhurried confidence of a man who knew exactly what was about to unfold. Grant assumed at first that this well-dressed stranger had simply recognized a valued customer, perhaps someone important enough to warrant special attention on the showroom floor. "Mrs. Ellison?" Malcolm said, his voice carrying just enough volume to draw the attention of everyone nearby. "I apologize for keeping you waiting." Grant froze mid-sentence, his mouth still open around a word he never finished. Derek turned sharply from across the room, his expression shifting from polite confusion to something closer to alarm. "It's fine," Imani replied calmly. "I wanted to see how things were running before we spoke." Malcolm extended a leather folder toward her, the kind used for formal documents rather than sales brochures, and Grant's eyes darted between the two of them with growing unease. "You two know each other?" he asked, his voice noticeably tighter than it had been moments earlier. Malcolm glanced at him, unbothered, almost amused. "Not just know each other," he said. He turned toward Derek, whose face had gone pale. "You weren't informed yet, were you?" he asked the young salesman. Derek shook his head slowly, clearly lost. Malcolm returned his attention to Grant, delivering the sentence that would rearrange every assumption Grant had built his marriage upon. "Mrs. Ellison is the new owner of this dealership." Grant laughed, a short, disbelieving bark of a sound, certain this had to be some elaborate misunderstanding or an awkward joke gone too far. He kept laughing, even as Malcolm set a stack of transfer documents on the nearest desk, the ink barely a few weeks dry, the signature at the bottom, unmistakably his wife's. Grant leaned closer, his laughter dying in his throat, as his eyes tracked down the page and landed on two words printed in bold at the top of the ownership documentation. "Imani Ellison, majority owner." He read it twice, as though the words might rearrange themselves into something less humiliating on a second pass, but they remained exactly where they were, patient and immovable. Imani did not look at him. She simply said, quietly, "I purchased this dealership 3 weeks ago." The silence that followed lasted long enough for Derek to shift his weight twice, and for a customer near the entrance to glance up from her phone. Sensing that something significant had just occurred, though she could not have said what, Grant finally found his voice, though it came out smaller than he intended, stripped of the confidence that had carried him through the entire morning. "Why?" he asked. "Why would you buy this place?" Imani turned to face him fully for the first time since they had walked through those glass doors together, her expression unreadable in the way that made people nervous when they had something to hide. "Because I needed to know what you were doing here," she said, and the words landed with the weight of a door closing somewhere far away, somewhere neither of them could see, but both of them could hear. What followed shifted the mood of the room entirely, sliding away from the sharp sting of marital humiliation and into something colder, something closer to financial reckoning. Imani asked Malcolm to bring her the files they had discussed earlier that week, and he retrieved them without hesitation, clearly having anticipated this exact moment. He explained, in measured tones meant for her ears, though everyone nearby could hear, that the audit team had uncovered a pattern of irregularities in the weeks leading up to the sale's finalization. Several vehicles had been sold well beneath their appraised value. Certain payments had been routed through an intermediary company that did not appear anywhere in the dealership's official records, and scattered throughout an email chain connected to those transactions was a name that kept surfacing again and again: Grant Whitmore. Grant denied it immediately, his voice rising into something defensive and brittle. He claimed he had merely offered casual advice to an acquaintance, nothing more, certainly nothing that deserved this kind of scrutiny in front of his own wife and a room full of strangers. Imani did not argue with him. She simply asked one question, calm and precise as a scalpel. "Who is Roland Pike?" she asked. Grant's mouth opened, then closed again. And for the first time in 11 years of marriage, Imani watched her husband lose control of his own composure in public. Malcolm filled the silence Grant could not. Roland Pike, he explained, had attempted to purchase this dealership himself months earlier, only to be outbid and pushed aside during negotiations. Since then, he had been quietly reaching out to employees, searching for a way back in through means far less legitimate than a straightforward offer. It became increasingly clear, as Malcolm continued, that Grant had positioned himself as the bridge between Roland's ambitions and the dealership's internal operations, whether he had fully understood the implications of that role or not. Derek, still standing nearby, offered a small detail that confirmed the timeline Malcolm had been building for weeks, mentioning a series of after-hours meetings Grant had scheduled under the guise of exploring a personal purchase, meetings that had nothing to do with buying a car at all. Imani felt something crack open inside her chest, not quite grief and not quite rage, but a third feeling entirely, the particular ache of realizing a marriage may have been used as a tool rather than lived as a partnership. Grant, sensing the ground shifting beneath him, reached for justification instead of honesty. "Everything I did," he said, his voice rising, "was for us." Imani looked at him steadily, refusing to let the sentence pass unchallenged. "No," she said, "it was for you." Malcolm, watching the exchange with the practiced patience of a man who had seen many difficult conversations unfold across dealership floors, opened one final folder and set it gently on the desk between them, and inside it was something far more damning than paperwork. The recording began with a burst of static before settling into two clear voices, one of them unmistakably Grant's. In it, he could be heard telling Roland Pike, with a casualness that made Imani's stomach turn, that his wife understood nothing about cars or finances, that she trusted him completely, and would never think to question anything he told her. "She trusts me," Grant's recorded voice said, almost proud of the fact, as though her trust were a resource to be spent rather than something sacred. Hearing those words aloud, in front of Malcolm, Derek, and a handful of customers who had drifted closer without quite meaning to, hurt Imani more deeply than anything Grant had said in the showroom that morning. It was one thing to be underestimated by a stranger. It was another thing entirely to hear the man she had built a life with describe her blind faith as a convenient weakness. Grant lunged forward, trying to stop Malcolm from playing any further. but Imani lifted a single hand, and the room seemed to obey the gesture, without needing to be told twice. The recording continued, and it painted a plan far more calculated than casual advice between acquaintances. Grant had discussed using Imani's name and reputation to quietly approach potential investors, believing her credibility could be leveraged without her ever knowing. The ultimate goal, laid bare in his own recorded voice, was to apply enough pressure on the dealership's value that it would appear to be failing, cheap enough for Roland to swoop in and purchase it at a fraction of its worth. Grant, in turn, would collect a generous commission for engineering the collapse from the inside, a payday built entirely on his wife's unknowing back. Imani turned to face him fully, her voice low but unwavering, cutting through the tension like a blade drawn slowly rather than swung. "You were going to sell something you didn't even think I knew I owned," she said. It wasn't quite a question. Grant said nothing, his jaw working uselessly, searching for words that no longer existed. When he finally spoke, it wasn't an apology. It was an accusation, aimed squarely at her instead of himself. "You changed," he said. "You got cold. You have too much money now, and it made me feel like nothing." Imani absorbed the words without flinching, though something in her eyes hardened into a kind of clarity she had been circling for months without quite reaching. "I never made you feel small," she said. "You just couldn't stand that I didn't need you to feel big." Grant's voice cracked as he delivered his final threat, the kind of ultimatum men reach for when every other form of control has slipped through their fingers. "If you do this," he said, "if you actually go through with whatever this is, our marriage is finished." Imani looked at him for a long moment, unmoved, unshaken, the fury of the morning settling into something far more permanent and far more dangerous than anger. "No," she said quietly. "It ended long before today started." I just hadn't said the words out loud yet. What Grant did not yet understand was that Imani's plan had never truly begun in that showroom. It had begun months earlier, in the quiet hours after he fell asleep, when she sat awake reviewing financial statements and cross-referencing names that kept appearing in places they shouldn't. She had suspected his connection to Roland Pike long before she ever set foot inside this dealership as a customer. She had not purchased the business out of impulse or spite, and certainly not to prove a point about wealth or status. She had purchased it because she needed a vantage point close enough to see exactly how deep the betrayal ran, and because dozens of employees who had nothing to do with Grant's scheme deserved protection from the fallout that Roland Pike would have brought crashing down upon them. Malcolm produced additional documentation, legal in nature, outlining months of due diligence that had quietly unfolded behind the scenes long before Grant ever suggested visiting the dealership that morning. He explained how Imani had first flagged the irregular transactions during a routine review of the dealership's financials, long before it ever occurred to Grant that his wife might be circling closer to the truth than he assumed possible, and how each subsequent finding had only deepened her resolve to see the process through to the end rather than confront him prematurely. Derek, visibly shaken by everything he had just witnessed, admitted something he had been too afraid to say aloud until now. Grant, he confessed, had pressured him weeks earlier to alter certain sales reports, framing it as a harmless favor between men who understood how business really worked. Grant's face drained of color as the full scope of his exposure became undeniable. The careful architecture of his scheme collapsing floor by floor in front of the very people he had once tried to control. "How long?" he finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How long have you been watching me?" "Long enough to know I can no longer trust you," Imani replied, her tone free of triumph, carrying instead the quiet exhaustion of someone who had hoped, right up until this very moment, that she might somehow be wrong. Grant's posture shifted then, confidence giving way entirely to desperation, and he began pleading in a way Imani had never heard from him before, promising he could fix everything, promising this had all spiraled beyond what he intended. Imani did not answer with words. Instead, she reached into the folder Malcolm had handed her earlier and withdrew a plain white envelope, setting it gently on the desk between them, the gesture more devastating than any accusation she could have spoken aloud. Grant opened it with trembling hands, and inside he found separation paperwork already drafted, along with legal documentation outlining an independent financial review. His eyes caught on a single line near the bottom of the page. All marital financial claims subject to independent forensic review. He read it twice, the same way he had read the ownership documents minutes earlier, and this time there was no laughter left in him to soften the blow. He understood, finally and completely, that Imani had not walked into this dealership unarmed. She had walked in fully prepared for exactly the war he had unknowingly started months before either of them ever crossed that threshold together. In the days that followed, Grant scrambled to salvage what little control remained to him, dialing Roland Pike's number repeatedly, each call ringing out into silence or disconnecting after a single tone. Roland, it seemed, had no interest in sharing the consequences of a plan that had unraveled so publicly and so completely. Imani, meanwhile, moved with the same quiet efficiency she brought to every major decision in her professional life. Closing off financial channels Grant had once used freely, notifying her legal team, and ensuring nothing remained within his reach that he might attempt to exploit further. There was no dramatic confrontation, no raised voices echoing through hallways, no scene designed for spectators. Her victory did not require noise. It required only steadiness, and steadiness was something Imani had never lacked. In the days between Grant's departure from the dealership and his eventual return to her office, Imani found herself returning again and again to the same quiet question, turning it over the way she might examine a contract clause that didn't sit right. She wondered how much of their marriage had been real, and how much had simply been Grant performing devotion for an audience of one, adjusting the performance whenever her success threatened to outshine his need to feel essential. She did not arrive at a clean answer, and she suspected she never fully would, but she made peace with the uncertainty rather than letting it consume her the way it might have consumed a younger version of herself. Late one evening, sitting across from her in a quiet room far removed from the showroom's fluorescent lights, Grant asked the question that had clearly been building inside him for days. "Did you ever love me?" he asked, his voice stripped of every ounce of arrogance it once carried. Imani let the silence stretch long enough that he began to fear she wouldn't answer at all. Then, softly, she said, "Yes." Grant lowered his head, some private grief moving visibly across his face. "Then why are you doing this?" he asked. Imani's answer came without hesitation, delivered with the calm certainty of a woman who had already made peace with the cost of her own boundaries. "Because loving someone," she said, "doesn't mean allowing them to destroy you." It was, perhaps, the truest sentence either of them had spoken since walking through those glass doors that morning, and it settled over the room like the closing note of a song neither of them had wanted to hear the end of. Just as it seemed the worst of the revelations had passed, Malcolm approached Imani with a folder he had deliberately held back until this exact moment, his expression suggesting there was still one piece of the story neither she nor Grant fully understood. "Mrs. Ellison," he said carefully, "there's something else you need to know." Imani studied his face, sensing immediately that whatever came next would recalibrate the entire situation once again, shifting the blame in ways she had not yet anticipated. Malcolm explained that Roland Pike, for all his ambition, had never actually been the architect behind this scheme. He had simply been a willing instrument, motivated by opportunity, but lacking the resources or the reach to orchestrate something this calculated on his own. Someone else had been guiding events from a distance. Someone with far deeper history and far sharper motive. That someone, Malcolm revealed, was Cedric Vale, a name Imani had not heard spoken aloud in nearly 3 years, though it landed with the force of an old wound reopening without warning. Cedric had once been her business partner, before a catastrophic deal collapsed under circumstances that ended their professional relationship in bitterness rather than resolution. He had blamed Imani publicly for failures that were, in truth, far more complicated than a single person's fault, and he had never quite recovered his standing in the industry afterward. When Grant crossed his path, whether through calculated targeting or simple misfortune, Cedric recognized an opportunity to finally exact the revenge he had been quietly nursing for years, using Grant as an unwitting weapon aimed directly at the woman who had once been his equal. This revelation reframed everything, though it did not erase Grant's culpability so much as complicate it. He had not been the mastermind behind this elaborate betrayal, but neither had he been an innocent bystander swept along by forces beyond his control. He had made choices, each one deliberate, each one a small step further away from the trust his marriage had once been built upon. Imani understood this distinction clearly, refusing to let sympathy for his manipulation soften accountability for his actions. He had been used, yes, but he had also been willing, and willingness was the line she could not allow herself to forgive so easily, no matter how sympathetic the larger picture had become. Imani spent a long evening afterward reading through everything Malcolm's team had assembled on Cedric Vale, tracing the slow unraveling of a man who had once sat across conference tables from her as an equal, sketching out ambitious plans on whiteboards they both believed in. She remembered the deal that ended their partnership, remembered how publicly he had blamed her for losses that belonged to both of them in equal measure, remembered how quickly former allies had distanced themselves from her, once his version of events spread through the industry faster than the truth ever could. She had rebuilt everything from that collapse without asking anyone for sympathy, and she was not about to let old resentment steer her response now. She closed the file eventually, set it aside, and reminded herself that the only opinion of her value that mattered anymore was the one she had finally learned to hold for herself. Rather than allowing anger to consume her energy moving forward, Imani chose a different path entirely, one rooted in restoration rather than retribution. She let the appropriate legal channels handle Cedric Vale's involvement, refusing to let old wounds dictate her next move. Her focus shifted instead toward rebuilding the dealership itself, ensuring the employees who had nothing to do with this entire mess would not suffer for decisions made far above their pay grade. She appointed Malcolm as the operating chief executive, trusting his integrity completely after everything he had helped uncover. She kept Derek on staff as well, recognizing that fear, not malice, had driven his earlier compliance with Grant's requests, and that people deserved the chance to correct course when circumstances allowed it. She also arranged, quietly and without fanfare, for the employees who had been pressured or misled during Grant's involvement to receive a formal assurance that their positions were secure, understanding that fear left unaddressed tends to calcify into distrust that lingers long after the original threat has passed. Standing before her newly assembled team one quiet afternoon, Imani delivered a simple statement that would come to define the culture she intended to build from that point forward. "A business cannot be built on fear," she told them, her voice carrying the same measured authority it always did, without needing volume to command attention. It was a sentiment that extended far beyond the walls of that dealership, though none of them fully understood its deeper resonance yet. A week later, as Imani sat working late in her office, long after most of the building had emptied for the evening, Grant appeared unannounced outside her door, and something in his posture told her immediately that this visit carried a different weight than his previous attempts to reach her. He had not come seeking money, and he had not come seeking reconciliation either, though both possibilities crossed her mind before he spoke. Instead, he simply said, "I came to ask for one last conversation, if you'll allow it." Imani studied him for a long moment before gesturing toward the chair across from her desk, curious, despite herself, about what remained unsaid between two people who had once believed they would spend the rest of their lives together. Grant sat down slowly, looking smaller somehow than he had in that showroom weeks earlier, stripped of the confidence that had once seemed woven into the very fabric of who he was. What followed was not an argument, but something closer to a confession, delivered without the defensiveness that had characterized every prior conversation between them. Grant admitted, finally and completely, that he had been ashamed of Imani's success for years, though shame was a word he had never allowed himself to use until this moment. He confessed his fear that other men viewed him as lesser, as somehow diminished by standing beside a woman whose accomplishments so thoroughly outpaced his own. He admitted that his need for control had never truly been about their marriage at all, but about a fragile self-image he had been protecting at any cost, even the cost of the very relationship that image was meant to preserve. He described, almost clinically now, how he had used that single sentence in the showroom, telling Derek she couldn't afford the car, as a way of reclaiming some small sense of power he felt slipping away from him with each passing year of her career. Imani listened without interruption, offering him the dignity of being fully heard, even after everything that had transpired between them. She found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she did not need him to suffer in order to feel whole again, that watching him finally speak honestly was enough, that closure could arrive quietly, instead of arriving through punishment. There was a strange mercy in simply letting him say the truth out loud, after years of watching him dress it up in confidence and control, and she allowed herself to receive that mercy without guilt. When he finally finished, the room settled into a stillness that felt almost peaceful compared to the chaos of recent weeks. "You used to think money made me strong," she said quietly, breaking the silence at last. Grant looked up at her, uncertain. "Isn't that true?" he asked. Imani shook her head slowly, her answer carrying the weight of everything she had learned about herself throughout this entire ordeal. "No," she said. "The truth is what made me strong. Money was simply the tool I used to find it." He nodded slowly, as though only now understanding a distinction that had been sitting in plain sight throughout their entire marriage, one he had been too afraid of his own smallness to ever really look at directly. Their marriage ended not long after that conversation, quietly and without spectacle. The paperwork finalized in the same measured, methodical way Imani approached every significant decision in her life. There was no final shouting match, no dramatic scene played out for an audience that had never truly existed outside their own private world. Grant simply gathered what remained of his belongings and walked out of a life he had spent years trying to control rather than share, leaving behind a silence that felt, to Imani, less like loss and more like space finally being returned to her. She stood in her office afterward, looking out over the dealership floor below, watching the same black sedan Grant had once claimed she could never afford sitting exactly where it had been the day this entire story began. Malcolm approached her from behind, his footsteps unhurried, and asked gently whether she wanted to finally take that car for herself, given everything it had come to represent. Imani considered the question for a moment, then smiled, a genuine smile, the first one that had touched her face in weeks. "No," she said. She walked down onto the showroom floor instead, past the sedan that had once been the center of so much humiliation and revelation, and chose a different vehicle entirely, something simpler, quieter, unburdened by the need to prove anything to anyone who happened to be watching. She no longer required an object to announce her worth to a room full of strangers, because she had finally stopped needing anyone's permission to recognize that worth within herself. As she stood beside her new choice, signing paperwork with a steady hand, Derek approached from across the floor, a hesitant but genuine smile spreading across his face. "Mrs. Ellison," he said. She turned toward him, unhurried. "Yes," she answered. Derek's smile widened slightly as he delivered the final words of that long, transformative chapter. "Welcome home, owner," he said. Imani looked out across the showroom one final time, taking in every detail of the space she now fully controlled, the space that had once been the setting for her greatest humiliation, and had since become the foundation of her quiet, undeniable reclamation. For the first time since walking through those glass doors weeks earlier, her smile reached all the way to her eyes, unguarded and entirely her own. A person can underestimate you simply because they cannot see everything you carry, everything you have built, everything you have quietly survived while wearing the ordinary clothes of an ordinary life. But what they cannot see, they also cannot diminish, no matter how loudly they try to convince a room otherwise. Imani Ellison did not win because she turned out to be wealthier than the man who once dismissed her in public. She won because somewhere between that showroom floor and the empty office where her marriage finally ended, she stopped asking anyone else to confirm what she had always quietly known to be true about her own value. And in the end, that quiet knowledge proved to be worth far more than any car parked beneath those bright showroom lights ever could.